Awesome. Okay, welcome everyone. This is the first Living Systems live Zoom event. It's going to be a monthly occurrence and there is no format at all at this stage. It may turn into a webinar type thing, but at the moment we're just going to make it a live conversation where one person talking at a time, but really just as it feels right to contribute on the subjects that we're talking about. And what I thought was this first session, we could talk a bit more about the meaning of regenerative agriculture and agriculture as a focus, and perhaps even just talking about farms like pastoral livestock farms, because it goes very wide if you talk about regenerative in general, and we need to narrow it down somehow. So regenerative agriculture, and not trying to define it, but perhaps trying to determine what it is the theme for this session. But you can go in any direction from that you wish to. What I thought might work well is if we just open the floor to whoever wants to start, and maybe just say what you want to say about the subject, and then after 5 minutes or so, someone else unmute and come in and say another piece that links to that related to regenerative agriculture. And at the end of it, we're going to have determined what regenerative agriculture is. All right, Shane?
Yep.
Cool. Do you want to kick us off, or does anyone else feel like they have something burning at the moment to share? Oh, and the other thing, if you don't mind, just say your name and where you're from, and just briefly who you are when you start talking first, so that everyone knows.
Cool. Okay, well, I'll kick it off then. So, kia ora everyone. My name's Shane Ward. I'm the founder of Action Ecology, and I basically help connect people with knowledge around regenerative land use. I suppose I was quite excited to be a part of this discussion because I'm quite passionate about this topic, and particularly around the question of can or should we define regenerative agriculture. I'm of the view that we absolutely can and we absolutely must define it, with a strong caveat that we need to do it well, which to me means that by doing it well, we don't restrict the practice of it or the evolution of it. And I suppose maybe the bone of contention with some people is that they feel that by doing that, by defining it, we are in fact restricting what it is. And I don't agree. I just feel like it's a design challenge, effectively, of designing the definition to be appropriate to what we're talking about. The part of the reason why I think it's important is because, I mean, everything needs to have a definition. I mean, that's the purpose of language. If we want to be communicating something, if we want to be talking about the same thing and be on the same page, we need to have some form of common understanding. And particularly, I think as a movement, for lack of a better term, around the world, regenerative agriculture is in a very important phase of its evolution and development. And it's really important, I think, to sort of help support that growth and evolution, that we can communicate it to people. And so I think it's, personally, I'll put it this way, I don't like the idea of trying to leave it too open, because it actually just feeds the critics and makes it harder for people to engage with it. It almost puts an artificial bump in the road. Those who are already over the bump and in it and doing it, they don't care if you define it or not, because they're quite happy. But everybody else that's on the other side makes it harder for them to get in and engage. And I think that that's to its detriment, ultimately. I'm curious, Dan, as to why you wanted to, not define it, or, like in this conversation, why do you want to talk about that? And second of all, why just pastoral? Because to me, when we're talking about regenerative farming, regenerative agriculture, whatever, regenerative land use, which is the term I tend to use, I think it's important that we include all land use. that's productive. And I make that distinction, I suppose, because while I think you could possibly manage national parks regeneratively, and probably should, we're generally not talking about conservation, locking up land sparing, for just rewilding. That tends to not be what we're talking about. We tend to be talking about all the other productive uses of land. We're also not talking usually about urban development, though potentially there's an argument for how that could be regenerative too. But generally speaking, we're talking about productive land use, producing food, fibre and fuel. And obviously there's lots of forms that can take. And one might say, arguably, that for it to be regenerative, or in some way supporting the enhancement of life on that land, it must be more than one thing. In fact, one could argue, if you are only doing traditional pastoral land use, can that be truly regenerative? I don't have an answer to that. I'm just simply asking the question. Can any one land use, viticulture, grazing cows, whatever, growing pine trees, can any of that truly be regenerative if it's a monoculture? So I would just perhaps push back against that sort of narrowing, and say that we do need to narrow it to a degree, but fundamentally the purpose is, for me, just so that we know when we're talking about it or not it. Where are the goalposts, even roughly, like what is regenerative agriculture and what isn't it? So I think that's a really important thing for us to know, and I'm happy to sort of talk, in more detail about that, but maybe I'll open the floor to other people to share their views on where they're coming from with that.
I think that's beautiful. I think that's what we're going to discover today, Shane.
I think just one point from Shane's spiel there. I think you sort of touched on something. It was probably you touched on kind of active versus passive regenerative agriculture in a way, and that like conservation, that type of thing, it seems to be passive, but it feels like we need to define it in the scope that it's active, right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that for me, that the definition that I sort of came up with from merging lots of different things is very much about the design and management. Those two things, these are both sort of human, us as stewards of the land, guardians of the land. And just before I turn myself on mute again, I about 2-3 years ago, somebody actually asked me, what is regenerative agriculture? Can you give us a definition? And of course I thought, well, that'll be easy. So I went on Google and I thought, I'll just go to the usual places and all the people that have been doing it and all that sort of stuff, and I'll pull one together. I didn't have one to hand, and suddenly I realized, well, actually, no, it's not easy. No one had what I thought was a particularly comprehensive or good one. There was lots out there, people having a stab at it, and they were all fair, but I felt I needed to weave many of them together. So I sort of did that and then reworked it and then came up with something as a starter, which I was kind of hoping that I would have many of these conversations with people in the space to kind of chew it over and make it better. But yes, I agree that it's very much about what we are doing. It's a very active thing.
Hey, Jono, is there any chance I could be able to share my screen?
Yeah, man, sure. Can you do that currently or not currently?
No, not currently.
Okay.
You might have to make me a host.
Yep, I'll do that right now. While I'm doing that, are you going to introduce yourself, Dan, or should we continue with introductions while I'm doing that? Well, you're effectively a host now, but...
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm Dan Redstein. I have a business called Recon Ag, which is about mapping and planning environmental sort of stuff on farm. And it's really about being holistic in the way that you think about the land and people's relationship to the land. And it's ever evolving. So regenerative really fits with my business interests and what I do. So I'm just going to share my screen. Just so that I can show you the document that got me really thinking about this. And I shared it on Living Systems, and I didn't agree with a lot of it. And there was a comment from Shane saying he didn't agree with a lot of it as well. But that's a really good place to start a conversation, is when there's stuff that you really don't agree with, to look into why you don't agree with it and what would be an alternative, or is it possible to define something or not? And so you can see this now. Can everyone see? No.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Oh. All right, I'll try again.
And it's just and the other cool thing about what Dan's creating there is that it is okay to disagree. We don't have to agree.
Yeah, we're never going to completely agree. Can you see
Someone
my,
just
my screen?
sorry, I was just going to point it out. Someone said to me recently, I think, is it a Māori saying? I can't remember that. I loved it. It was this idea that if we all row on the same side of the waka, we just go around in circles. I thought that's genius. That's it, really.
That's it. So I think you can see my screen now. Am I right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the article. And I just quite liked the diagrams. I don't agree with this particular diagram, degenerative being one side and regenerative being the other side, but the thought of it being a continuum was quite relevant, I thought. And particularly, I just wanted to flick between the different diagrams, but this one in particular, I thought was quite a good way to visualize what we're actually talking about, the complexity of what we're talking about when we say regenerative agriculture. And you're shaking your head, Shane, so I'd like you to talk to this diagram.
Okay.
And yeah, just say what you want to about this sort of concept.
So interestingly, I actually have the opposite view on those two diagrams than you do. I think the degenerative regenerative one is it's by no means exhaustive. Like it's not the whole story, but I mean it's a good enough way of trying to say, well, you're going one way or the other, in the sense that from a sort of ecological standpoint, you are either talking about disturbance and the degeneration of ecological function, which is essentially what we've been doing for the last 70 or 80 years with industrial agriculture, taking things out of the ecosystem, damaging the ability for the land to function and heal and all that sort of stuff, or you are doing things to allow it to regenerate and go the other way. But so I mean, I feel fine with that one. It's very simple and it's simplistic, but this one, however, I dislike strongly. The reason being, and I hear this repeated a lot in talk around regenerative agriculture, and I think it's actually the Savory Institute that sort of perpetuate this particular view. And I disagree with it because it puts sustainable in the middle, and obviously degenerative at one extreme and regenerative at the other. I understand where they're coming from with this. And I hear this all the time, people saying, oh, no, it's not enough to be sustainable, we've got to be regenerative. I think that is a way too simplistic and kind of, it misses the point, frankly. When you're talking about, shall we say, energy, if you're talking about generating electricity and things like that, what is unsustainable is obviously to dig up fossil fuels, because it's a finite thing, and derive all your energy from that, because that won't last forever. Therefore, it is unsustainable. When you're talking about living systems, I think they're missing a really key thing. You can't sit in the middle and be sustainable with a living system, because living systems aren't static. At the end of the day, life is dynamic. So, anyone who spent a bit of time looking or studying natural living systems realizes that these things are constantly moving and shifting and going backwards and forwards. So it can't just sit still, which means it is either sort of degenerating or regenerating when we're talking about the human sort of management and design of these things. So it can do that quickly, or it can do it slowly, depending upon the time scale we're talking about, like of a human lifetime, for example. But it never sits still. So for a living system to be sustainable, it must be regenerative, because living systems have a feature that other systems, human design systems, don't have, which is the capacity to regenerate, right? To generate, to create new life. They are inherently regenerative. So in order for a living system to be sustainable, in other words, to carry on forever, and if we're talking about things like food production systems, we're saying we would like our food production system to be able to carry on forever and not have an inbuilt sort of end by date, and i.e. not built on fossil fuels and all this other stuff, right? So to get to that point where it is sustainable and can be sustained forever, because sustainable has a meaning, a definition, then it needs to be regenerative. There's no other way that can be sustainable other than to nurture the innate regenerative capacity of that living system. That was probably a way too wordy explanation, but do you sort of get where I'm coming from?
Yeah. On that greater scale, sustainable has got to be regenerating. So having the word sustainable in the middle is misleading, or it's just not appropriate to say.
Not when we're
in the
talking
middle
about
is
living
sustainable.
things, yeah.
Anyone else want to speak to this diagram?
I'd like to jump in, guys. I really like, Shane, what you just said about the dynamic nature of living systems. And I think if we start defining what regenerative systems look like and how they act, we have to basically, we can't take snapshots and look at them in isolation. We have to look at the performance over time. So we have to look at changes in dynamic systems. And that, to me, is a pretty simple benchmark. If you start with a degraded piece of land and you apply regenerative principles and methods, you will see improvements in all sorts of indicators. And we all know what those are. And to me, that improvement is what we're seeking. That improvement is what regenerative systems are all about. It's not like we're trying to achieve some sort of pinnacle or endpoint. We're on a pathway, and anything that you do to push the system into more of a self-regulating, regenerative aspect is the right thing. There's no single silver bullet. There's no single thing. We could say, oh, well, diverse species. Well, yeah, sure. No till, of course. Mob grazing. Yeah, we know all the standard principles and methods. Any one of those in isolation can do something to help a system, but the more things that you apply in a holistic sense, the better you're going to do in terms of proving the model effectively. And by not focusing on a static endpoint, we're recognizing that every situation is different. People are all starting from different baselines. They've got different ideas. They've got different needs, whether those are, economic drivers, whether they're, the situation, circumstances of climate, soil type, aspect, things like that, that we recognize that you can't just take a snapshot of a piece of productive land and say, oh, well, this is regenerative. Regenerative is not the condition of the land. It is the pathway that the land management itself is on. And then I guess something else that I kind of lost my train of thought, but I think you see where I'm going with this, though, that what we're looking at is not so much the static definitions, but just a way of saying that if you're doing these things along a pathway, it doesn't necessarily matter what order you apply the steps or how much of any one thing you do, that the proof will be in the evolution of the system toward a more regenerative one. And I think that's something that we as a community, in a lot of ways, can we can do a peer regulation model. So rather than having some sort of top-down bureaucratic system that says, well, if you're going to be certified regenerative, you have to tick all these boxes and you have to go through this paperwork and fill out these forms and be audited once a year or once every 3 years. And it's going to cost you this. And instantly we've put off at least 50% of our audience, because on one hand, as Shane was saying, we do need a framework. We do need a consistency and something that tells both the practitioners and the public, whether they're consumers or industry people or skeptics and critics, we need something that says to the external audiences, is this actually regenerative? And do we have a means of assessing whether it's regenerative? But I think a lot of that has to be back down at the individual level, and then supported by the network, where we can all sort of say to one another, well, yeah, I've seen so-and-so's farm, and there's no doubt that he is seeing improvement and these things that he's doing are working. It doesn't mean that any one of us has achieved some sort of mythical pinnacle. It just means that we're on the way, and that these systems are becoming better at managing themselves, which in a way is what we're all after. So, yeah.
I thought that was beautiful, Phil. I've never met you, Phil. Can you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, back to front. Yeah, I'm Phil Stevens. I've got a sort of a regenerative hat that I wear, coming out of many years doing organic market gardening and permaculture education, and then more recently getting pretty deeply into soil carbon. So that's, yeah.
Cool. What was present for me in hearing you share, Phil, was human beings' desire to define and categorize. And when you get attached to a term or a title, yes, you have to define it. And the more I continue this journey and the more I deal with the huge diversity of people and where they're at, and just the individual complexity and how variable that is out there and amongst the farmers of the world, the less attached I am to this term regenerative agriculture. And when you detach yourself from the term, all of the anxiety around defining it disappears. And like you say, like the way I looked at it was from you hearing you share, Phil, and beautiful how you said pathway, because before you said that, I was picturing we're all on this hillside and we're all looking at these mountaintops and we're all arguing which top to go towards, but none of us are seeing the path. And there's some people walking upwards towards whatever peak, and there's some people that are standing still, and there's some people going backwards. They don't want to go that way. And that's just what was there for me, this picture in my mind. It sounds pretty crazy, but that's just what came in my head when you were speaking, Phil.
It's really interesting points, Jono. It's funny. There's a few things that you.
Does it make you cringe, Shane?
No, not at all. Actually, it's a nice sort of reflection on the other facet of it, because.
Dan, can we please drop that screen so we can see our speakers?
Sure.
I completely hear where you're coming from, and I don't really disagree with any of it. I mean, but I sort of see that there's several things that we sort of want from regenerative agriculture farming, and certain things that it needs itself as a movement. And so when you were talking about the mountain peaks and the path, that really struck home with me, because often I find myself actually just using that almost exact same metaphor when people ask what it is that I do. And I say, well, I'm often where I'm the most effective at doing some good in the world is when someone is just at the crest of the hill and they can see over into the next valley, and they realize that there's a valley there and they need to work out a way to get through it, but they're not quite sure how. And I act as a guide to help them get through that until they're familiar enough to continue on their own journey. So when you mentioned that, it just like completely resonated with me. The term sort of, well, saying that we're attached to a term or that there's anxiety around it, I suppose I see where you're coming from, but partly I don't just see regenerative agriculture as just about farming and farmers. That's something that's become really clear to me over the last year, that in actual fact, while farmers transitioning to regenerative farming and similar sorts of approaches, in other words, that are not trashing the planet but actually restoring life, is fundamental, and it is 100% necessary, but it is not sufficient, because we are all stakeholders in the food system. Everyone who eats food, everyone who drives a truck that ships it, everyone who works in a factory that processes it, or even just, you know, packs it into a box or whatever it is. We are all stakeholders in some form or another. So to transition to a better food system that's not destructive, that involves everybody. And I feel, and so from my tour around the country speaking to regenerative farmers, one of the subjects that kept coming up that I just thought was really interesting was about what next. I mean, so say you do sort of get more confident on your journey as a farmer managing your land well. What I noticed in New Zealand was that a lot of them had done great things, but they were just sort of still isolated as just individuals in a sort of market of non-regenerative farming, and their output, their product or whatever was just often just going into the same vat as everyone else's or whatever. You know, there was no distinction, there was no price premium or nothing to, not even a story. And so while I'm not necessarily advocating for price premiums per se, or organic sort of regenerative organic certification or any of those things, at the same point, you know, we have to, I think, sort of deal with what we're facing, which is a food system and a market driven economy. That's what we're up against, and to sort of maybe help springboard a higher uptake and also higher recognition and reward for some of those farmers, we've got to engage with that and work out some clever ways of, you know, making these stories, making some value to people who are going to be the end citizen shoppers. Give them something to grab onto, because I hear also a lot of people who don't know anything about farming and say, I want to do something good. What do I do? You know, I'm and many others are telling them, care about where your food comes from. Okay, how do I do that? How do I care? I go to a supermarket or wherever I go and there's just this wall of stuff. How do I tell? And so what I'm getting really excited about is how do we connect these stories up? You know, and so certification is one of the ways that we could do that. And so Phil's point was really interesting about, you know, if we only look at organic certification, if we look at that as the only possible model, then yeah, I too would be like, forget that. But is that the only model? What if we were to have some other way of saying, well, you know what, we do need to have some sort of transparency, you know, some way for someone who's just in a shop in a city or wherever, where more than half the world lives, to connect with that, and that they can trust, even if they don't know the farmer yet. But we need to make sure it's not bureaucratic, that the bureaucracy and the cost doesn't fall on the farmer. You know, what if we did that? You know, these kinds of things. And I guess to agree with Phil as well, the point about it's not about a destination, it's about a process. I largely agree. I think there probably is some sort of destination. It would look different on every farm, but possibly there is some end state whereby we are in harmony with, you know, each farm is in harmony with its environment and doing all this sort of stuff. I don't know what that is, and I don't think it really is that meaningful to try and define it now anyway. But you're absolutely right. You know, there's techniques and tools which we all sort of know about in the regenerative space, but the key difference, of course, between organics being a certified thing and regenerative is that we're not wedded to any one tool or any one combination of tools. And I think the last thing I'm just going to say, and let other people talk, I'm sorry, is when we think about, okay, well, what is regenerative, or what, you know, how can we just define something which can be so sort of, you know, I don't know, philosophically rich and all this sort of stuff? I would just say back to you then, what is carpentry or construction? What is parenting? What is guardianship? These things all have definitions, but they're also vast. I mean, you know, you can, so many ways you can do those things. There's so many things that you can generate from that, but yet I think we can still have a definition for them.
That was a great link, Shane, to parenting and carpentry, because to me, those two things are so relevant to regeneration and regenerative agriculture, because, you know, parenting is about generating. It's about generating new life. It's about generating a person who's going to be a citizen of a place. And carpentry is about building a house. You've got to start with a place and build the walls and somehow construct something to live in, but you're not going to be living in there all the time. That's just somewhere, your base. And you're going to venture out in all directions and it's a really good link to make, I think, because ecology is, the definition of ecology is linked to home, the household. So it's the studying of the household. So those things, parenting and carpentry, are so relevant. But it does also get really, really big and really philosophical, and that's why I kind of wanted to keep it onto farming. And to me, just speaking about that diagram and what I've heard so far this morning, soil is so key. Like the soil and the microbiology within the soil is just about the most important ingredient to changing a direction, I suppose, of farming. And I'm only talking about pastoral agriculture at the moment, livestock-based agriculture, to keep it kind of tight. Focus on the soil and the microbiology within that soil is the change of direction, and everything else fits around that and links up to it. Because if you're generating soil, then you must be generating more life and more relationships on the land, because the soil is basically the medium for growing life. And so by focusing on the soil and by focusing on nurturing the life within the soil, which is vast majority is microbiology, that is regenerating, that is regenerative fundamentally. But then everything else, it just blows up. It's massive. So that's just what I had there to say.
Just to add to that, just before we carry on, is that Cynthia? I'm interrupting.
Oh yeah, I just need to say, because I've got to go shortly. I just wondered if I could just say something. Hi, I'm Cynthia. I'm based in Eastern Taranaki at the moment, though. I'm house sitting close to our maunga. But when we moved on to our hill country farm 26 years ago, one of the first things we did was we were given a map by the Taranaki Regional Council identifying land use capabilities. Now, I go back to that map and keep going back to that map because one of the things I see is that we seem to have been one of the only people in our area that actually have acknowledged the map and what it's telling us. And so the where we are looking to to use our land as the best, using the best use, the best use of land. What do I say? The land use is the best use. And so one of the things that Shane talked about, where he sort of said, retirement conversion, that's not what we're talking about. For me, it actually is. It's all part of this regeneration of the land that we've been, that we are kaitiaki of, and that being able to shut the gate on the land that needs to be reverting and regenerating is also part of this whole regenerative picture, and then we can concentrate on the better land. And for me, with a vast majority of our land in Aotearoa, which could be managed differently, then I think we need to acknowledge that the best use of land use is really important. And this is, a lot of the principles that we're talking about have been around for years and years and years. It's just that out there, it's not being done. And the second thing I want to say, and I agree with Jono and Phil and Shane in what you've been saying, but it is a pathway, and I do absolutely see Jono sitting on the side of the hill as I do too, and I work a lot with farmers in the education sector, and everybody's at a different place, but it is a being, it is a way that they make their decisions thinking about everything at that time. So regenerative is very much about how they think and how they see the best use of their land.
Wow, it's almost like rather than what your farm is, it's who you are that your farm is, or who you are that your system is. Because often, you hear people talk about it, and I certainly refer to it a lot, as it's like, if you don't address who you are or who you're being about your enterprise or about your purpose in life, it's all these sort of meaningless attachments that are a bit like trying to go for the peak of the hill rather than the journey of the hill. A lot of people will take on regenerative principles subconsciously wanting to prove it wrong just so they can be right about it not working, because who they are is not that they want it to work or that they are regenerative agriculture. It's a challenge for those people to step out into a new paradigm. And that's the second thing I wanted to mention before I interrupted, or while I interrupted you before, Cynthia, was what I can hear are two things. One thing is the dealing to or creation of regenerative practices within the existing paradigm. So adding to, changing, building from, improving, making better, all with the traditional predicate of the existing paradigm, including its markets, its transportation, its definitions, everything. And then there's this other area, this big, scary area, which is a brand new paradigm, which sometimes I dabble in, and it's like this. It's quite a scary place, but it's quite fun too. And a lot of people aren't ready to go there yet. But I think perhaps one day we should have a call about that other paradigm, that whole big picture thing of what the world could look like if we were to start from nothing. None of the past, no predicate, no having to adapt or change or bring with things from the past. And yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Jono, I totally agree. And if I can jump in here, Mark Croning, I'm a change leadership coach. And what you just said that sort of I wanted to key in on, Jono, is kind of this idea that a farm in this instance is like what it looks like is a projection of what's inside a farmer or a practitioner. And that's the piece, that's the hardest piece. And that's what my work is all about, is helping that internal transition to get that change or behavior that we're looking for.
Just before you carry on there, Mark, beautiful. Just pause there. I want to capture something for you. So how I used to farm, just for 2 seconds. How I used to farm, look what I found. I found this photo of who I was when I was farming like that. Is that scary? That's who I was, controlling my farm. Manipulating. Okay, see the difference?
Amazing.
That's who I was, so carry on.
Yeah, I'll try and keep this concise, but I think that there's something that I can add to this conversation. And it's very much about this journey. I think what we just both talked about is that it's a journey of moving forwards, and we all start at different places. And it's the movement which is the most important piece. And coming at that with some humility to enable that movement is ultimately going to serve us all the best. But in terms of the definition piece, I agree in some ways around like not defining it at some level, but being very tight on defining it at another level. And I think the way that we can look at that is in the levels of why, how, and what. So I think it's very dangerous to define what it is. But I think it's quite constructive and even necessary to define it at the why level, and potentially incredibly useful to define it at the how level. And so just to bring in a piece on each of those, the why level was values. So in this case here, I would talk about regenerative as being valuing nature, valuing ecosystems, valuing life, aliveness. I think ultimately there shouldn't be too much debate about that. And if we want to go there, we can. The next piece of it in the how level is coming up with principles that are the translation of what can be quite nebulous in terms of values and actually making it practical. So principles can do that. And I think that the living systems principles, what we know from them, what defines something to be alive or not, is really insightful. So again, this is nature telling us the answer. It's not our mind or our heart or our gut necessarily. It's nature providing that answer of how to do it. And then in the what level, that ultimately comes down to behaviors, and behaviors are going to obviously look very different for different people as where they are in their journey and their different contexts, etc. And so that's perhaps where the most breadth can be in terms of what it looks like. The last thing I'll say on behavior is connected to assessment. And I think that if we bring in the idea of phenomenism and more of a qualitative sense to this, we can sense into a place as being, hey, is this alive or not? Is this in practice what it's looking like, alive or not? And is it moving in a direction which is more alive? And that for me is actually the most important piece, rather than some really hard numbers that say other things that might be harder to interpret, or cold data, which doesn't really touch us so much. The last thing I wanted to say here was the sort of debate a little bit around how broad regenerative is. And whilst I 100% agree with you, Dan, around focusing on the soil, if we do that, and you kind of, you touched on this, that once we start doing that, we realize that it actually needs to spread out into every other aspect of human economy and human life, because it's impossible, I claim, it's impossible for a farm to regenerative if there isn't enough regeneration happening around that farm in terms of all of the consumers and supply chain and governance and legislation, all these things. And what we're getting at here is around the idea of connection. And we all in many ways need to be regenerating, both as individuals and as groups and as ecosystems together, ultimately to achieve, some future place that we might want to get to, that peak of the mountain that you were speaking about, Jono.
That's an awesome mark. Sorry, I want to respond to a couple of things, if that's all right. And I love the way you just looped that right around, because I was actually making 4 points that I wanted to come back on, and then you just brought it nicely right back down to the first one, which was Dan's point about the soil being so key. Which I can completely agree with, but I just wanted to point out something. I don't know if you noticed yourself saying this, Dan, but you talked about soil being the medium for life. But then, of course, you came back in the sentence or two later saying it actually is living. But that's the point. It's not a medium. That's sort of this shadow of the sort of conventional way of looking at it as a medium for which other stuff happens, rather than it actually being the thing which is happening. And which I know but it was just interesting to notice that little linguistic twist. That, the key thing, it is the gateway drug, isn't it, of regenerative agriculture? It's like once you get hooked on seeing that your soil is alive, you suddenly begin to switch on to this idea that I'm actually dealing with a living ecosystem. This is a biological system that I'm working with. This is not a mechanical system. This is, and so what I like about that, which is something that Mark pointed out really well, which is essentially that you could surmise the key difference between a sort of conventional industrial mindset and a regenerative mindset as being that we've just been using the wrong metaphor. For all these generations, we've been using this mechanical metaphor for life, for the human body, for the natural world that we're trying to work with, the language that we use, it's all the language of the production line. And we talk about inputs, outputs, process, production, efficiency, economies of scale, producers, consumers. This is factory talk. This is completely inappropriate metaphor for trying to deal with actually living things. And so what I find fun as well is that I've noticed with certain farmers is that, sometimes the key thing is they might get it at a certain point, but the moment that they begin to realize that soil is living, that then makes them start to realize, oh, holy shit, this whole thing is actually living. This is a biological thing I'm interacting with. And so it becomes like a gateway drug, a Trojan horse, if you will, that once you kind of get them over that, then all these other things start to become possible. Ways of thinking become possible that may not have been before. And I think Jono knows that as well as anyone. The second thing, just to Cynthia's point, I thought was really good, and I just wanted to clarify, maybe if I wasn't quite clear, this idea of stewardship over the land, I think is really central to regenerative farming. And when I say we're talking about productive land use, I suppose maybe that could be misconstrued. That is not to say that there isn't any space for native wildlife, sort of pristine wilderness in that. There must be, in fact, because if we are to have any sort of genuine biodiversity value or just life-giving capacity in that landscape, there has to be a role for wildness, for native, wilderness, wherever we are in the world. And I think actually this ties back to one of the key debates raging in conservation in the last few years, which is this idea of land sparing versus land sharing. Land sparing, in a nutshell, being we lock out parts of the planet, and that goes back to wilderness. And then the bit that's left over, we double down on, we intensify even more than before to drive higher yields from. I don't agree with that perspective. I like the other one, which is land sharing, where actually what we do is we look at the landscape as a living ecosystem. We work with that to harvest surplus whilst maintaining biodiversity and economic, and function, healthy function, and get an economic return from that. To me, that's the only way there's only way forward. So yeah, I very much agree with you that, putting certain areas should absolutely be back into nature 100%. And then other areas, it should be a mosaic, a blending where we actually have, function across the whole thing. The third thing, Jono's point, was about this possible world that we want to maybe think about. I love talking about this stuff, and some of my presentations and stuff I've given, I try to sort of allude to this stuff. To me, I started off, I guess, on all of this coming through permaculture, where it's a design methodology. So we are, in permaculture sort of thinking, the management comes further down the track. You start with design. You've got to put this, the right stuff in the right place. You have to understand your context. You have to look at the landscape as a whole first, and you think about what is this sort of possible thing that you could be doing. You stand back and say, how can I rearrange some of this stuff or put stuff back in a way that's going to enhance the function and the life of it. So to me, that sort of design mindset is really a key part of regenerative agriculture, perhaps one that's a bit underappreciated, because for absolutely the right reasons, 90% of people start with where they're at. They're already a farmer, they're already doing one thing. So that is the sensible place to start in terms of changing your management. That's the low-hanging fruit. But that's not to say that that's all it is. There is also this other thing of, what am I doing? Not just how am I doing it, but what am I doing? And am I doing the right thing? Or what other things could I be doing? And how do those things integrate? Is there an ecosystem of practice or land use in this as well? A whole diversity of things. Is that appropriate? Now, of course, you've got to do that within reality of the system that you're in. But nevertheless, this idea of, well, what is this possible? Well, what might that look like? What might our food system look like? Our world, our society, if we were to really embrace these ideas and fundamentally ask those questions about, what are we doing, and is this the right thing to be doing? Which brings us to Mark's point, which I really like, is that in some ways that design thinking piece about what it could be, whether that's the farm, community, country, society, globalized world, whatever level you want to look at it, it's the change journey that's the tough bit. That's where I've sort of started to kind of come into, and where Mark and I have had some really good conversations, because in some ways identifying what that could be, even just broadly in broad strokes, isn't as challenging as working out how to get there. I mean, you need to do that first, because otherwise, where are you going? If you don't know which compass bearing you're setting off on, you could go in a completely different direction. You need to have a rough idea, I think, of what direction you're heading, even if you don't know exactly what it is where you get there. But you do need to find out how is that journey possible? How do you actually get from where we are today to there? Otherwise, it's all just dreaming, and it doesn't sort of ever manifest into anything. And that is super hard, but really exciting, because it involves personal change, but it also involves change at these broader levels. We've got to interact with the systems that we have. And so, in the corporate world, change management is a discipline that actually looks at that and tries to understand the psychological underpinnings of how people go through change, and understanding where they're at, each individual person or as a group, and trying to help them move through that journey. And I think it's really valuable, and it's something we kind of really need to be thinking. And then just to finish off on Mark's points of the why, the how, and the what, I agree. Actually, that's quite a good way of thinking about it. I would actually, though, maybe flip and say I agree on the why. I would flip the how and the what, because I actually think that, and this is where the rub is for people trying to define regen ag, is that they don't want the how to be defined. They want the freedom to try all kinds of different ways of getting to this sort of place, which, you know, I'm completely comfortable with. In fact, it needs to be so contextual that trying to pin down the how you do it leads us more back towards the organic approach, which is to say these practices are allowed and these ones aren't, and so on and so forth. So in some ways, I would almost say the why, yes, the what of where the kind of place we need to get to, i.e. we are designing and managing landscapes in a way that supports life-giving processes and regeneration and good stewardship. All this stuff is the what, and the how doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how you get there as long as you get to that place. I'll leave it on that.
Can I jump in there? Wow, that was great, Shane. Thank you for that. And you linked a lot of ideas all together. And Cynthia, you said you had to take off soon, so feel free to do that whenever you need to. That's fine. And I heard you say, I think, Cynthia, it's a being. And that really struck me, because I think that is strong. Like, you're saying it's a being, that can relate to all of what we're talking about. Like, what is regenerative agriculture? Well, it's a noun, but if it was a being, then it would be a verb. It would be we're regenerating. That's a verb, and that's a being. And you can also look at it as though, well, the land, if you look at the land as a being, well, suddenly it's alive. It's changing, it's moving, it's living. So that idea of it being a being, shifting the focus from it to who, is really powerful. And when you were talking, Shane, and you were picking up, you were discussing what Mark was suggesting about why, how, and what, that really made sense, because what, looking at the word what, you're kind of asking what sort of noun is it? And so I get Mark's point of view that it's dangerous to define it as a noun, as a what is it? But more helpful to be looking at the how, and particularly behaviors, which is a doing, which is a being and a verb. But perhaps we could define regenerative agriculture or determine regenerative agriculture as a being. And I think somewhere there, I've kind of lost it, but somewhere in what Shane was saying, he was suggesting that flipping the what and the how was making the what into a how. So I don't know if anyone can get something from that, but that was really cool. Thanks.
You made a really good point, Dan, and actually I just realized that the challenge of framing just in how, what, and why is it can be very powerful, but it's not sufficient. You need to move to the next level, because I just realized you can actually phrase those questions in completely fundamentally different ways. So how could be, how do you do it, which is about process, or how can be, how does it feel when you're there, right? So it can be talking more about the end state. So really my point isn't so much maybe a how or what thing, but rather we need to be focusing on a goal and an end state, which is not necessarily rigidly defined in terms of it must include X, Y, and Z, but it must be regenerative. Like I said, it must be life-giving. It can't be something else, right? It can't be degenerative. In some ways, it's a very simple thing. It's not, it allows for so much, but at the end of the day, there is something that we all want to get to. And however we want to describe that, you know, it should be clear that that end state, that sort of path that we're heading, that compass bearing that we need to get to, is one which is a life-giving, you know.
Right now, it feels like we're dabbling into something like defining happiness and how crazy we are about it, and how it's something we all want to get and get to. But show me a definition of happiness. Anyone?
Could look it up. But you know.
If I could just jump in here real quick. So basically, I'm Michael, by the way, Michael Morrison. I work in New Plymouth, and I mainly deal with lifestyle block people. So I'm in this sort of middle zone of people wanting that sort of farm, well-being in nature lifestyle, but they're pretty much city slickers. So I'm dealing with that side of it, and I really see that they're grasping just for that well-being. They want to work with nature. They want to walk through their pasture and see their animals and everything super happy and everything just working as a cohesive team and unit. And I think that's where a lot of my regenerative work is coming in, is really just educating these new people, these city slickers basically, on how to just enjoy work and enjoying pastures and things like that. So I really sort of resonate with that well-being as the main thing you should strive for, and then work further from that. You can work on more regenerative and really expand the work that you're doing and give it to the community around you.
Thanks, Michael. Sounds awesome. And you have to go, Matt. So thanks very much for being here. See you later.
So I'll jump back in real quick. Mainly with what I'm working around is a lot of different livestock options and incorporating different livestock. So a large problem here in New Plymouth with the lifestyle people is they actually have quite a lot of horses. And the way they work is they gnaw everything down, and they're very selective, and then you're meant to move them quite often, so you don't get this compaction happening, and sort of element that just horses bring is hugely different to what I've previously worked around with cows and sheep. And I've been really trying to incorporate getting these lifestyle block people to bring in the cows and have them follow up the horses. So push the horses along. They selectively graze what they really like, and trample a bunch of stuff, move them on to a new paddock, bring in a few cows to clean everything up, even everything out, so you don't get this sort of worse species coming through in your pastures, and then moving them on a sort of like 30-day rotation out of paddocks and things like that. I'm just wondering from anyone else's perspective is, have you worked alongside horses at all with compaction or selective grazing, and how do you guys sort through that?
I haven't worked at all with horses. Sorry, Michael. That's got to be a challenge, and especially small properties can be really challenging to do a livestock model and try and do really good selective, grazing, regenerative grazing management. Do you have anything on that, Jono?
One, just really glad to hear, Michael, that you're out there doing that. One thing that's come up for me is that every small-scale lifestyle block owner that is brave enough to put their hand up and have a conversation mostly starts with, oh, look, I'm just a da-da-da lifestyle block, just a small-scale thing, like almost like they don't count, like they dismiss themselves. But if you look, I was just actually chatting with Ange Clifford from the food farm and ETNZ this week, actually, just on just the sheer amount of land that small-scale farmers occupy, and that the biggest limiting factor that I can see, is that that a lot of these farmers, and I'll call them farmers because they are don't want to engage because they feel like they don't matter. And in the traditional sense of like having to get services like contractors, drilling, spraying, etc., from having been to spraying contractors, yeah, they didn't matter. Like I put them right at the bottom of the list of priority, and right now I see an opportunity to really make a difference in that area and to make sure that they are included in this conversation as equal priority to those of large scale land use. So that's one thing. And then the other thing was just having a chuckle to myself about horses and how, I would say challenging, because I think my girlfriend's floating around the house. She's got a horse. Lovely thing. Great things to have. Yeah. But challenge, yeah. I mean, some horses can't even eat fresh grass. They've got to be on grass that isn't existent. It's got to be all hard fed. It's I can only imagine the task at hand, Michael.
Yeah, it's.
Can I agree? Oh, sorry, Michael, go.
No, it is a struggle, but I feel like most lifestyle block people don't really know much about their soil. It's kind of like just chuck a few cows out there and you're good kind of thing.
Can I say that I don't know whether that is any more or less true with farmers. I think there are farmers who've farmed for 40 years and never seen their soil through a microscope and realize that there's living things in there. Some lifestyle block people, as we call them, actually can be easier to work with because they don't come in with preconceptions, and don't feel that there's some sort of challenge involved of, if they're taking advice from somebody that, that they're somehow being criticized by having a different idea or any of that sort of stuff. They're not, and to be honest with you, they're not lifestyle block owners. They are ecosystem managers, whether they realize it or not. It's the same with farmers. We're all ecosystem managers. We just choose to either realize that or not. And I say that all the time. Keep saying it. You'll get so sick of hearing me say it. That's just the reality. That's just the reality you're dealing with. It's an ecosystem out there. You can choose to ignore it or you can choose to engage with it. And really, that's just a mindset thing. So, and at the end of the day, horses, animals are tools. Some farmers are tools. Most consultants are tools. But really, at the end of the day, right, that's what it is. And I think that if we get trapped in this whole thing of, it's about the horse, how do I make the horse work? It can be quite tricky. I always sort of say, let's just take a step back and go, well, what is the ecology of this thing? And where does it fit into my system? What is its role, and how do I make that work? I mean, I personally haven't worked with people with horses, but I have worked, had discussions around things like goats and pigs, and like they all have their own challenges, chickens. And instead of saying, how do I make this animal work, I tend to try and just take the step back and look at the system, look at the ecology and say, well, what role is it performing and what are the other things going on? Goats are quite a classic one. They can be high disturbance, right? Famously high disturbance animals. But if you ignore the ecology of the goat and you say, oh, well, I can't just have it out there on my pasture, it's it's getting too much, the parasite load's too high, blah blah blah, they end up putting them in a barn, and then it just sort of starts to, the whole kind of way that they're managing starts to degrade. I've spoken with organic goat people in the Waikato who tried to do have organic pastured goats. They just couldn't maintain the health because the parasites were so strong, so they had to put them in a barn, and then they had to bring them all their feed, and then it just starting to look a little bit like an industrial system. It's like, well, where's the ecology in this, right? And I tried to have the conversation and say, well, why don't we look at how we design a forage system, a perennial forage system for the goats? And because fundamentally they are browsers, not grazers. You can't treat them like they're a cow, and if you treat them like they're a cow, it's not going to work because you're trying to force a human idea onto an ecological reality. And she just said, oh, but I grow good grass on my farm. So her answer was grass. So she wanted goats and she had grass, and she was going to make that work, even if she had to cut the grass and bring it to the goats with a whole bunch of imported feed. So to me, this was an example of not realizing that she was an ecosystem manager, right? So I know that's a long-winded way of not answering your question, but do you know what I'm saying? I think, that's the challenge, right?
Mm.
And you've left me with a great question I'm going to ask my girlfriend tonight is, what is the role of that horse? What is the role of that horse? Yeah. You
Yeah.
might see me come on next month with a big red side of the
handprint.
face.
Okay.
Yeah. We have to go and get the feed from Timaru, bring it to Heinz. We have to continuously mow the feed. The horse does nothing.
Oh
Anyway.
yeah. I basically at least there's some stuff around horses with pasture, different types of pasture out there, because they've got, you know, catwalk, which is like a mix of 6. I know it's only 6, but 6 different pasture. So at least there's some movement towards adapting and adding more pasture out there. But yeah, there's a lot of people who just hard feed, and it's a struggle.
As a practical point, have you read Nicole Masters' book, The Love of Soil?
Yes, I have.
There was some stuff about horses in there, wasn't there? I think I
Yes.
recall she was working on some.
Yeah, it's not very expansive, but it definitely has some good details that you can kind of weave between the lines and find your own path. Yeah.
I'm going to have to run soon, Dan.
Right. Oh, this is so good. Ecosystem managers, back to that. I reckon that's got to be a really key thing to determining what regenerative agriculture is. And maybe it's just another word for regenerative agriculture, ecosystem management. Because the ecosystem is kind of the regenerating bit. It just does its own thing. It's something that cycles, something that lives, something alive. And then the management is the people's impact on that ecosystem, and trying to do it in such a way that we can get some good food production and some good what we want out of that ecosystem, whilst not destroying that ecosystem, so that going into a industrial sort of controlling mindset of, okay, this is a piece of land and I want to extract from this piece of land. How do I do that best? But changing that into this is an ecosystem, it's living, and I want to to fulfill needs, namely food production, and maybe some defined types of food production from this ecosystem. How can I do that whilst not destroying the ecosystem?
Exactly. And I never really thought of it in terms of a definition type of thing, but particularly around identity, which I think comes back to a lot of what Jono talks about. You know, that the thing which I find I run into a lot is identity is the barrier. You know, so by shifting people's, so I say that to shift people's perspective on their identity. Like, is the problem here the fact that I'm bringing an identity to this, which forces me, or shall we say, just constrains me? I don't see all the tools that I have available to me in my toolkit because my identity is making me think I can only use a hammer and a screwdriver. You know, so by reflecting on the identity piece, we can widen that toolkit that now becomes available. That's the way I think of it.
That is, beautiful way of saying. Man, so what I can see this conversation, we started with an idea and we didn't really talk anything about what we really wanted to talk about, but that's cool. And so now we've got a start point. We don't really know where it's going, but I'm liking it. And we've been here for an hour and 15. I see people are dropping off. No doubt you've all got things you need to do. What are our next steps now, Dan? What do you reckon?
I really liked how you summed that up, Jono. And from my perspective, I think we've talked exactly about what we came here to do.
Yep.
Which was regenerative agriculture determination, and I'm so excited about what's going to come from this point. And to what you said, we've got a start point, and I'm really enjoying it, and you said you're enjoying this point. And to me, that is a doing, like we're doing something.
Yeah.
We've got a direction, we've got a starting point, and we're enjoying it. So it's almost regenerative agriculture.
Ecosystem management.
Well, either way, we're winning, right? So it's a good thing. That's
Yeah.
the same time next month,
We're all tools, and
basically. That's the takeaway.
We just like to think we're some of the sharper ones in the shed.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Crikey, I'm as blunt as they come.
That could be the T-shirt. Living systems. We're all tools.
I like it.
Merch.
I do.
Yeah. Oh man, this is cool.
Proud to be a tool.
Yeah.
I'm a tool.
I may be a tool, but I'm a tool for change.
That's right. Out and proud. We're tools.
Let's get that done. And as we share these discussions, no doubt more people will join. They'll become more powerful. I can see this thing not coming to an end point. It'll just forever change. And is everyone happy with monthly? Or we're all busy people. What's our thoughts?
Monthly fits for me, guys.
Yeah, same.
For sure.
Monthly's about right.
Good for me, yeah.
Cool. So are we going to roll with the last Thursday of every month? Is that what it is? It's Friday.
Friday.
Yeah. Fridays are good. Friday morning.
Maybe we just keep it loose.
I'm on holiday. I'm on school holiday mode. It's like, like I said, I've been listening to recorder and guitar since 6 a.m.
Nice.
Cool.
Awesome, guys.
Are we happy with the just open format of it? So it's just a real loose conversation? Or
I think so.
Next time, sorry, Phil, go.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, if somebody's got something on top, it could be a springboard. But yeah, I kind of like the free flow.
Yeah, and what do we think about? This might be a bit crazy, but what do we think about real live? Like I upgrade my Zoom account to allow for live through the social media circles. Is that too crazy? Because Dan and I sort of like the idea of not editing anything, and live's like it just does that.
Well, this not to get off topic, but this comes back to some of the conversations that we've had, Jono and Dan, about like how you want the living system thing to work. Like, do you want people to come, like, make this an exclusive thing that, well, not exclusive in the sense that people can access it, but like to be on the live thing, do you need to be part of living systems? Or, you can maybe get the recording afterwards. Or I know it depends if you want to use that as a draw card or if you just, maybe you just want to advertise it out. I don't really mind either way, but I'm open with anything. But
I sort of like the idea of just, this is my personal thing, is just
put it out there.
Just, yeah. I don't know what that means, but that's, Anyway, something to think about.
Yeah, something to think about. Cool. Well, I'm going to run, guys, but we can agree all that stuff, I guess, before the next one.
Nice.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for your
Thanks,
time
everyone.
and your contribution.
Thanks,
Awesome, guys. Thanks very much. See ya.
Awesome.
Oh, Dan, you're the host now. You're going to have to stop the recording.
Okay, sweet. Oh, nice to meet you, Michael.
Yeah, nice to meet you guys.
Yeah, same
Nice to
here,
finally
Michael.
meet you. I've just been following Quorum Sense and Recon. Yeah, I've just been following everything for quite a while and doing my own thing with my own microscope and stuff like that. So it's good to connect with other people.
Wow.
It's great.
No, thanks so much for joining, man. Great to be in touch.
Okay, see you next time.
Cool, man. Can you see that recording stop?
I better stop recording.
Yeah. Voice